Miyamoto Musashi was not a philosopher in the academic sense. He held no lectures, published no treatises on metaphysics, and never walked the halls of any university. His philosophy was shaped not by books, but by battle, by the raw, immediate logic of survival at sword's edge. Born around 1584 in Japan, Musashi is remembered as history's greatest swordsman. But that title alone fails to capture the essence of the man. Over 60 life-or-death duels did not just forge his reputation, they refined his soul. With each encounter, he emerged not only undefeated, but transformed. His blade cutting a path toward a deeper understanding of life, death, and the self. His philosophy wasn't learned from books or masters, but carved out of moments when a single mistake meant instant death. Every duel was a laboratory for understanding the deepest truths about courage, timing, perception, and what it means to be fully alive when everything you are hangs in the balance of a sword's movement. What makes Musashi's worldview so powerful is its complete integration of thought and action, mind and body, philosophy and practice. He didn't theorize about life. He lived it at the absolute edge where theory becomes useless and only direct understanding can save you. If you're drawn to these explorations of unconventional wisdom, I genuinely appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It supports this work more than you might imagine. I'm always fascinated to know where these ideas are finding you. So share in the comments what city you're in and what time it is there. There's something beautiful about our global community connecting through these timeless teachings. Now, find your most comfortable position. Maybe lower the lights and let the world outside fade away. And let's journey together into the mind of a man who turned the art of killing into the deepest wisdom about living. We're going to discover why you don't need a sword to understand what Musashi learned about mastery, presence, and the way of true strength. Unlike other warriors who philosophized from positions of retirement or safety, Musashi developed his insights while his life hung in the balance of split-second decisions. His understanding of human nature came not from observation, but from reading the intentions of men who wanted to kill him, learning to see through deception when a moment's confusion meant death. When Musashi talks about fear, he speaks as someone who transformed terror into clarity in over 60 life-or-death encounters. When he discusses the nature of timing, he draws from experiences where being a heartbeat too early or late meant the difference between victory and death. Perhaps most importantly, Musashi understood that true philosophy is not something you think about, but something you embody completely. Every movement he made, every decision in combat, every word he wrote in his later years reflected his deepest beliefs about how life should be lived. He didn't separate his ideas from his actions, which is why his teachings have such power to transform how people approach not just martial arts, but existence itself. This is philosophy as lived reality, tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Part 1. The Way of No Way, Embracing Formlessness. The foundation of Musashi's philosophy rests on what he called the way of no way, a paradoxical understanding that true mastery comes not from rigid adherence to form and technique, but from transcending all forms to achieve perfect spontaneous response. This wasn't abstract spiritual theory, but practical wisdom, born from the recognition that in real combat, no two situations are ever identical, and survival depends on your ability to adapt instantly to whatever emerges. Musashi learned this lesson through years of studying different sword schools, each with their elaborate techniques and prescribed responses to various attacks. He mastered these forms completely, but gradually realized that in actual combat, opponents rarely behaved according to the textbooks. Real fighting was chaotic, unpredictable, and full of variables that no system could account for. The warriors who survived longest weren't those who had memorized the most techniques, but those who could abandon all techniques when necessary and respond purely from intuitive understanding. This insight led Musashi to develop what he called no sword, the ability to defeat armed opponents while using only natural movement and improvised weapons. He would fight with wooden swords, boat oars, or even his bare hands against skilled swordsmen carrying steel, and win through perfect timing and positioning rather than superior weaponry. These victories proved that technique was less important than understanding the deeper principles that made all techniques work: distance, timing, rhythm, and the ability to read an opponent's intention before they themselves knew what they planned to do. The way of no way also applied to mental approach. Musashi discovered that holding too tightly to any strategy or preconceived plan made you predictable and therefore vulnerable. In his most famous duel with Sasaki Kojiro, he deliberately arrived hours late, not from disrespect, but as psychological warfare, knowing that anger and impatience would disturb his opponent's mental clarity. He carved his wooden sword from a boat oar on the way to the duel, adapting his weapon to be longer than Kojiro's famous steel blade. This improvisation and willingness to break conventional rules gave him the advantage that technical superiority alone could never provide. This philosophy extended far beyond swordsmanship into every aspect of how Musashi approached life. He refused to be bound by social conventions, religious dogma, or cultural expectations that didn't serve his understanding of what was true and effective. He lived as a ronin, a masterless samurai, because serving a lord would have required him to compromise his independence and authentic way of being. He studied painting, poetry, and sculpture not as diversions from martial arts, but as different expressions of the same fundamental principles of harmony, timing, and natural action. The way of no way requires tremendous courage because it means giving up the security that comes from following established patterns and rules. Most people cling to systems and structures because they provide the illusion of safety and certainty. But Musashi understood that this attachment to form actually makes you weaker and less capable of dealing with the unexpected challenges that life inevitably presents. True strength comes from developing such deep understanding of basic principles that you can respond appropriately to any situation without needing a rulebook to guide you. This approach also demands complete honesty about what works and what doesn't. Musashi tested everything through direct experience rather than accepting traditional wisdom simply because it was traditional. If a technique failed in real combat, he discarded it regardless of how elegant or historically respected it might be. This empirical approach to learning made his understanding incredibly practical and reliable because it was based on results rather than theory. The way of no way ultimately points toward a state of being where action emerges spontaneously from perfect harmony between mind, body, and circumstance. In this state, there's no gap between perception and response, no hesitation between seeing an opportunity and taking it. This is what Musashi called the true way. Not a method to be learned, but a natural capacity to be uncovered by removing everything that interferes with direct, authentic response to whatever life presents. Part 2. The Warrior's Mind. Presence under Pressure. Musashi's understanding of consciousness was forged in moments when a wandering thought could mean instant death. He discovered that true presence of mind wasn't a philosophical concept, but a survival skill. The ability to maintain perfect awareness and clarity even when facing the most terrifying and chaotic circumstances imaginable. This mental training went far beyond meditation or spiritual practice to encompass a complete transformation of how consciousness relates to fear, pressure, and uncertainty. The first lesson Musashi learned about the warrior's mind was that fear itself isn't the enemy. The attempt to avoid or deny fear is what destroys your effectiveness. In his early duels, he tried to overcome fear through willpower and aggression, but discovered that this approach actually increased his anxiety and clouded his perception. The breakthrough came when he learned to acknowledge fear completely while not letting it control his actions. Fear became useful information about danger rather than a paralyzing emotion to be conquered. This acceptance of fear led to deeper insights about the nature of presence. Musashi observed that most people live in a kind of mental fog, only half aware of what's happening around them because their attention is scattered between memories, fantasies, worries, and distractions. But in combat, this divided attention is fatal. You must be completely here, completely now, completely aware of everything that's happening in the present moment. This total presence isn't just useful for fighting, it's the foundation of all effective action and authentic living. The warrior's mind also requires what Musashi called mountain sea spirit, the ability to remain calm and stable like a mountain while simultaneously flowing and adapting like water. This paradoxical state combines the strength that comes from being centered and unmovable with the flexibility that allows instant response to changing circumstances. Most people are either too rigid or too chaotic, but the warrior develops the capacity for dynamic stillness, profound peace that doesn't interfere with decisive action. Musashi discovered that true mental strength comes not from suppressing emotions or thoughts, but from developing such clear awareness that nothing can disturb your essential equilibrium. Anger, excitement, doubt, and even physical pain become like clouds passing through an open sky, acknowledged but not identified with, experienced but not controlled by. This equanimity isn't indifference or numbness, but rather a deeper kind of sensitivity that isn't overwhelmed by what it perceives. The training of consciousness also involves learning to see beyond appearances to the reality underneath. In sword fighting, opponents often use deception, feints, and misdirection to hide their true intentions. Musashi developed the ability to read through these surface movements to perceive the underlying patterns and motivations that revealed what someone would actually do rather than what they pretended to do. This skill of seeing through illusion applies to all aspects of life, where people present false images or where circumstances aren't what they initially appear to be. Perhaps most importantly, the warrior's mind learns to act without attachment to outcomes. When you're fighting for your life, you can't afford to be distracted by hopes of victory or fears of defeat. You must focus completely on doing whatever the situation requires with perfect technique and timing, trusting that right action will produce right results without needing to control exactly what those results will be. This detachment from outcomes paradoxically makes success more likely because it eliminates the anxiety and second-guessing that interfere with natural ability. The cultivation of presence also reveals the fundamental interconnectedness of all experience. In deep awareness, the boundaries between self and other, inside and outside, action and stillness begin to dissolve. Musashi described moments in combat when he and his opponent seemed to move as parts of a single system, each responding to the other's actions with perfect synchronization. This unity consciousness isn't mystical escape from reality, but the deepest possible engagement with what's actually happening. Musashi's mental training ultimately points toward a way of being that's completely responsive to life without being reactive to it. This means developing the capacity to perceive clearly, decide quickly, and act decisively while maintaining the inner stillness that allows wisdom to emerge. It's a state of consciousness that's simultaneously relaxed and alert, peaceful and powerful, empty and completely full of whatever the present moment contains. Part 3. Strategy without strategy, the art of adaptation. Musashi's approach to strategy was revolutionary because it was based on the recognition that no predetermined plan could account for the infinite variables present in any real situation. Instead of developing fixed tactics to memorize and execute, he cultivated the ability to read the flow of circumstances as they unfolded and respond with perfect timing to opportunities as they emerged. This required a completely different kind of intelligence, not the ability to think faster, but the capacity to perceive more clearly and act more directly. The foundation of strategic thinking, according to Musashi, is understanding rhythm and timing. Every situation, every opponent, every moment has its own natural rhythm, and success comes from harmonizing with these rhythms rather than fighting against them. In swordsmanship, this means sensing when an opponent is off balance, distracted, or committed to a movement that leaves them vulnerable. In life, it means recognizing when circumstances are ripe for action and when patience is more appropriate than effort. Musashi observed that most people try to impose their will on situations rather than working with the natural forces already present. They have ideas about how things should unfold and become frustrated when reality doesn't conform to their expectations. But the true strategist learns to read what wants to happen and helps it along rather than forcing outcomes that require excessive struggle. This doesn't mean being passive, but rather becoming so sensitive to the flow of events that your actions feel inevitable rather than forced. The art of adaptation also requires what Musashi called emptiness, the ability to approach each situation without preconceptions about what should work or how things should go. When your mind is full of fixed ideas and past experiences, you can't see what's actually happening in front of you. But when you approach circumstances with genuine openness, you can perceive possibilities and solutions that wouldn't be visible to a more rigid mindset. This emptiness isn't ignorance, but rather a kind of informed innocence that combines experience with fresh perception. Musashi's strategic philosophy also emphasized the importance of maintaining multiple options rather than committing too early to any single course of action. In combat, this means keeping your stance and grip flexible so you can respond to whatever attack comes. In life, it means developing various skills and maintaining different relationships so you're not completely dependent on any single source of security or success. This flexibility requires confidence in your ability to handle whatever emerges rather than trying to control what emerges. The master strategist also understands the power of creating uncertainty in opponents while maintaining clarity in yourself. Musashi would often use unconventional approaches, arriving late, using unusual weapons, or adopting unexpected stances, not as gimmicks, but as ways of disrupting his opponent's mental preparation and forcing them to respond to something they hadn't planned for. This principle applies to any competitive situation where keeping others guessing while maintaining your own center provides significant advantage. Perhaps most importantly, Musashi's approach to strategy recognizes that the deepest victory comes not from defeating others, but from transcending the need for conflict altogether. The highest level of martial arts is being so clearly non-threatening yet unmistakably dangerous that potential opponents choose not to fight rather than risk the consequences. This requires a kind of presence that communicates both peaceful intention and complete capability, the embodiment of strength that has no need to prove itself. The strategic mind also learns to see patterns and connections that aren't obvious to more linear thinking. Musashi studied everything: architecture, painting, poetry, nature, because he understood that the same principles that govern sword fighting also govern all other forms of effective action. The way water flows around obstacles, the way trees bend without breaking in strong winds, the way master painters achieve maximum effect with minimum brushstrokes. All of these contain lessons about timing, efficiency, and natural movement that apply to strategy in any domain. True strategic thinking ultimately transcends strategy itself to become a way of living in complete harmony with the natural order. Instead of fighting against the way things are, you learn to work with fundamental forces and principles, achieving your objectives with so little apparent effort that your success seems almost accidental. This mastery looks effortless from the outside, but represents the culmination of years spent learning to perceive clearly, think simply, and act decisively without attachment to outcomes. Part 4. The Death of the Ego. Confronting ultimate reality. Perhaps no aspect of Musashi's philosophy is more profound than his understanding of how the direct confrontation with death transforms consciousness itself. Through 60-odd duels where his life hung in the balance, he discovered that the fear of death is really the fear of the dissolution of the ego, the constructed sense of self that most people mistake for their true identity. Learning to face death calmly meant learning to die before dying, releasing attachment to the small self in order to access something deeper and more fundamental. Musashi's first real understanding of this came during his early duels, when he noticed that his fear of dying was actually fear of not existing as the person he thought he was. The ego creates elaborate stories about who you are, what you've achieved, what you deserve, and what others think of you. But in the moment when a sharp blade is moving toward your throat, none of these stories matter. There's only the immediate reality of life and death, action and stillness, presence and absence. This stripping away of all psychological content revealed a deeper level of being that was completely unafraid because it had nothing to lose. The process of ego death through mortal combat taught Musashi that what most people call self is really just a collection of memories, desires, fears, and social roles that have no permanent substance. These psychological constructs are useful for navigating daily life, but they're not your true nature. When the ego dissolves under extreme pressure, what remains is pure awareness, consciousness without content, being without identity, life without the story of a particular life. This awareness is what actually fights, creates, loves, and lives, while the ego just takes credit and worries about the results. This understanding revolutionized how Musashi approached not just combat, but every aspect of existence. When you're not defending a fragile self-image, you can respond to situations with complete authenticity and effectiveness. You don't need to prove anything, impress anyone, or maintain any particular reputation. You can simply do whatever the situation requires with perfect technique and total commitment, because there's no separate self that might be threatened by failure or corrupted by success. The death of the ego also reveals the interconnected nature of all existence. When the boundaries of the separate self dissolve, you discover that you're not an isolated individual struggling against a hostile world, but rather an expression of the same universal life force that animates everything else. In his most intense duels, Musashi experienced moments when the distinction between himself and his opponent disappeared, and they moved together as parts of a single dynamic system. This unity consciousness didn't make him passive or mergy, but rather allowed him to anticipate and respond to attacks with supernatural precision. Musashi also understood that the ego's death and rebirth is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process that must be renewed constantly. The constructed self has tremendous survival instincts and will reconstitute itself from any available material unless you maintain vigilant awareness. This is why he continued to seek out the most challenging opponents and circumstances throughout his life, not from bloodlust or pride, but because facing death regularly kept him honest about who he really was versus who he pretended to be. The practical implications of ego death extend far beyond martial arts into every domain of human activity. When you're not protecting a fragile self-image, you can receive criticism without defensiveness, experience failure without shame, and enjoy success without pride. You can love without possessiveness, work without attachment to recognition, and create without needing approval. This freedom from self-concern actually makes you more effective in achieving worldly goals, because your energy isn't wasted on psychological self-protection. The confrontation with ultimate reality also teaches what Musashi called the acceptance of things as they are. Most suffering comes from the ego's resistance to circumstances that don't match its preferences and expectations. But when you face the ultimate non-negotiable reality of death, other difficulties become manageable by comparison. You learn to work with whatever conditions exist, rather than wasting energy wishing they were different. This acceptance isn't passive resignation, but rather the recognition that resistance to reality is the source of unnecessary suffering. Perhaps most profoundly, the death of the ego reveals that what you really are cannot be killed, defeated, or ultimately harmed by any external circumstance. Your true nature is the very awareness in which all experiences arise and pass away. This awareness is completely indestructible because it's not a thing that exists in time and space, but rather the timeless space in which all things exist. Realizing this removes the fundamental fear that drives most human behavior and allows you to live and act from a place of fearless love rather than defensive self-protection. Part 5. Mastery as a way of being. For Musashi, mastery was never about reaching a final destination or achieving a permanent state of perfection. Instead, it was an ongoing way of being that involved constant refinement, deeper understanding, and ever greater simplicity. True mastery, he discovered, was not the accumulation of techniques or knowledge, but the progressive elimination of everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. This process of refinement continued throughout his entire life, each stage revealing new depths and subtleties that had been invisible at previous levels. The path to mastery begins with what Musashi called beginner's mind, the willingness to approach each situation with fresh eyes, rather than assuming you already know what's happening or what response is appropriate. Even after decades of sword fighting and hundreds of victories, he continued to study his art as if encountering it for the first time. This wasn't false humility, but practical wisdom, because each opponent, each moment, each circumstance contained unique elements that demanded fresh perception and response. Musashi observed that most people plateau in their development because they become attached to the level of skill they've already achieved. They start protecting their reputation rather than continuing to learn, avoiding challenges that might reveal their limitations. But true mastery requires the courage to remain vulnerable to new learning, even when you've achieved recognition and success. This means being willing to look foolish, make mistakes, and have your current understanding challenged by experiences that don't fit your existing categories. The process of mastery also involves learning to distinguish between complexity and sophistication. Beginners often think that advanced technique must be complicated, but Musashi discovered the opposite. The highest levels of skill are characterized by extreme simplicity, movements that accomplish maximum effect with minimum effort, strategies that cut through complexity to address fundamental principles. This simplification isn't the result of knowing less, but of understanding so deeply that unnecessary elements naturally fall away. Mastery for Musashi was also deeply connected to character development. Technical skill without wisdom, courage, and integrity was not true mastery, but merely mechanical ability. He understood that becoming a master swordsman required becoming a master human being, developing the emotional maturity, mental clarity, and spiritual depth that would allow technical ability to be used wisely and effectively. This is why he spent years studying arts that had no direct connection to fighting, recognizing that breadth of understanding enhanced rather than diluted his core competency. The master's relationship to practice is also fundamentally different from that of the student or expert. Students practice to acquire new abilities. Experts practice to maintain existing skills, but masters practice as a form of meditation and self-expression. For Musashi, daily training with the sword was not preparation for something else, but the thing itself, a way of staying connected to the fundamental principles that govern not just martial arts, but all effective action. Musashi also understood that true mastery cannot be separated from teaching and sharing what you've learned. But this teaching doesn't involve imposing your methods on others or creating dependence on your knowledge. Instead, it means helping others discover their own authentic relationship to the principles you've embodied. The master points toward universal truths, while encouraging students to find their own unique expression of those truths, rather than copying external forms. The psychological qualities of mastery include what Musashi called no mind, the ability to act skillfully without conscious deliberation. This isn't mindlessness, but rather a level of integration, where technique has become so natural that it emerges spontaneously, without interfering thoughts or self-consciousness. In this state, there's no gap between perception and response, no hesitation between seeing an opening and taking it. Action flows directly from pure awareness without the mediation of analytical thinking. Perhaps most importantly, Musashi recognized that mastery in any domain is really mastery of yourself, your fears, desires, habits, and unconscious patterns that interfere with clear perception and effective action. The sword was simply the tool he used to confront and transform these inner obstacles. This is why his teachings apply to any field of endeavor. The principles of mastery are universal, even though their specific applications vary. Whether you're pursuing excellence in art, business, relationships, or any other domain, the path involves the same fundamental process of self-knowledge, discipline, and progressive refinement toward ever greater authenticity and effectiveness. Part 6. The intersection of art and war. Musashi's genius lay partly in his recognition that the principles governing martial arts were identical to those governing all other forms of creative expression. In his later years, he devoted increasing time to painting, poetry, and sculpture, not as hobbies or diversions from his warrior training, but as different ways of exploring the same fundamental truths about timing, balance, spontaneity, and the relationship between technique and natural expression. This integration of fighting and art revealed insights that neither domain could provide alone. In painting, Musashi discovered that the same qualities that made a sword technique effective also made a brushstroke powerful: economy of movement, perfect timing, and the ability to capture essence rather than merely copying surface appearances. His paintings were characterized by bold, confident strokes that seemed to emerge from deep stillness, capturing the spirit of his subjects with minimal but precisely placed marks. This taught him that mastery in any field involved learning to achieve maximum impact with minimum effort. The practice of poetry showed Musashi how the principles of Ema, the strategic use of space and silence, applied beyond physical combat to the realm of meaning and communication. In both sword fighting and verse, what you left out was often more important than what you included. A well-timed pause could be more devastating than a direct attack, and the spaces between words could carry more weight than the words themselves. This understanding of negative space became central to his strategic thinking in all domains. Sculpture revealed the importance of working with natural forces rather than against them. Musashi learned to see the finished piece hidden within the raw stone and to remove only what was unnecessary to reveal the form that wanted to emerge. This taught him about the difference between forced effort and natural unfolding, how true skill involved helping inherent potential manifest rather than imposing external ideas on resistant material. The same principle applied to developing students, managing opponents, and working with circumstances in general. Through artistic practice, Musashi also deepened his understanding of what he called the immovable mind, a state of consciousness that was perfectly responsive while remaining fundamentally undisturbed. In painting, this meant being completely absorbed in the creative process while maintaining the detachment necessary for clear judgment about when a piece was finished. In combat, it meant engaging fully with the life and death struggle while preserving the inner stillness that allowed wisdom and skill to function optimally. The intersection of art and war also illuminated the paradoxical relationship between discipline and spontaneity. Both domains required thousands of hours of rigorous training to develop the technical foundation that would eventually allow completely natural expression. You had to master the rules thoroughly before you could transcend them effectively. But the goal was always to reach a level where conscious technique disappeared and pure creative impulse could emerge without interference from analytical thinking. Musashi's artistic studies also reinforced his understanding of the importance of direct transmission beyond words and concepts. Just as martial arts could only be truly learned through physical practice rather than intellectual study, art could only be understood by doing it yourself rather than reading about it. This experiential approach to learning respected the fact that the deepest truths couldn't be captured in language, but had to be embodied through repeated practice and direct insight. The aesthetic dimension of Musashi's philosophy also included an appreciation for the beauty inherent in perfect function. Whether in a sword cut that ended a fight with a single motion, or a painting that captured the essence of its subject with a few bold strokes, he valued elegance and efficiency over flashy display. This aesthetic sense influenced every aspect of his life, from the simple furnishings of his dwelling to the spare, powerful language of his writing. Perhaps most importantly, the integration of art and war revealed to Musashi that all authentic creative expression involves a kind of death and rebirth. Whether facing an armed opponent or a blank canvas, you must be willing to let go of preconceived ideas about what should happen and allow something genuinely new to emerge from the encounter. This requires the same courage, whether the stakes are your physical life or your artistic reputation. The willingness to risk everything you think you know in service of discovering what you don't yet know. Part 7. Solitude and the cultivation of inner strength. Unlike many warriors who found their identity through clan loyalty or social position, Musashi chose the path of the Ronin, the masterless samurai who owed allegiance to no lord and depended on no institution for security or validation. This decision to live outside conventional social structures wasn't rebellion against society, but recognition that true strength could only be developed through complete self-reliance and the willingness to face existence on its own terms without external support or protection. Musashi's embrace of solitude began as practical necessity but evolved into philosophical choice. As a young warrior seeking to test his skills against the finest swordsmen of his era, he needed the freedom to travel wherever worthy opponents could be found. Serving a lord would have provided economic security and social status, but it would also have limited his movement and potentially compromised his ability to pursue truth through combat. He chose uncertainty and hardship over comfort and conformity because he understood that real growth only happens at the edge of your current capabilities. The years of wandering alone through feudal Japan taught Musashi invaluable lessons about self-sufficiency and inner resources. Without servants, advisors, or companions to rely on, he had to develop every skill necessary for survival. Finding food and shelter, navigating unfamiliar territory, reading the intentions of strangers, and maintaining his equipment and health. This comprehensive self-reliance created a deep confidence that came from knowing he could handle whatever circumstances life presented without needing rescue or support from others. Solitude also provided the psychological space necessary for honest self-examination. When you're constantly surrounded by other people, It's easy to define yourself through their reactions and expectations rather than developing authentic self-knowledge. But alone on the road, with only your own thoughts and experiences for company, you're forced to confront who you really are beneath all the social roles and personas. This inner work was as important to Musashi's development as his physical training, because it eliminated the self-deception and wishful thinking that could prove fatal in actual combat. The practice of extended solitude taught Musashi to distinguish between loneliness and aloneness. Loneliness is the painful feeling of disconnection that comes from needing other people's presence or approval for emotional security. Aloneness is the peaceful state of being complete in yourself without requiring external validation or companionship to feel whole. This distinction was crucial because warriors who fought from loneliness were desperate and therefore predictable, while those who fought from aloneness were centered and therefore dangerous. Musashi's solitary lifestyle also developed his powers of observation and intuition to extraordinary levels. Without the distraction of constant social interaction, he became incredibly sensitive to subtle changes in his environment. The quality of light that indicated weather changes, the behavior of animals that suggested human presence, the barely perceptible shifts in an opponent's posture that telegraphed their intentions. This heightened awareness was both survival skill and spiritual discipline, teaching him to read the deeper patterns underlying surface appearances. The inner strength cultivated through solitude was different from the aggressive force that most people associate with warrior training. Instead of building up psychological armor or emotional numbness, Musashi's solitary practice developed what he called diamond mind, consciousness that was completely transparent and indestructible. Like a perfect diamond, this mental state could contain and reflect any experience without being damaged or distorted by it. This allowed him to remain clear and responsive under extreme pressure without becoming hard or unfeeling. Musashi also discovered that true solitude wasn't just about physical isolation, but about maintaining inner independence even when surrounded by others. The deepest aloneness was psychological, the ability to think your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and make your own decisions without being unconsciously influenced by social pressure or popular opinion. This inner autonomy was perhaps more important than physical solitude because it allowed authentic response to circumstances regardless of external conditions. The cultivation of inner strength through solitary practice also revealed the paradoxical relationship between independence and connection. By becoming completely self-sufficient, Musashi freed himself to relate to others from choice rather than need. When you don't require other people's approval, affection, or support for your basic psychological security, you can engage with them more authentically and generously. This created deeper intimacy than dependent relationships because it was based on genuine appreciation rather than unconscious neediness. Perhaps most importantly, Musashi's embrace of solitude taught him that the ultimate security comes not from external circumstances, but from your own capacity to respond skillfully to whatever arises. No position, relationship, or material possession can provide lasting safety because all external conditions are temporary and subject to change. But the inner strength developed through solitary cultivation, mental clarity, emotional stability, and spiritual depth travels with you wherever you go and cannot be taken away by any external force. Part 8. The philosophy of perfect timing. Central to everything Musashi understood about effective action was the concept of perfect timing. The ability to sense the exact moment when circumstances align to make success not just possible, but inevitable. This wasn't mystical intuition, but practical skill, developed through years of careful observation and experimentation. He discovered that every situation has natural rhythms and cycles, and success comes from harmonizing with these patterns rather than fighting against them or trying to force premature action. Musashi's understanding of timing was forged in the crucible of mortal combat, where being a split second too early or too late meant the difference between life and death. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when an opponent was about to attack, the barely perceptible shift in weight, the slight change in breathing, the momentary tension that preceded movement. But more importantly, he developed the ability to sense when his opponent was psychologically off balance and therefore vulnerable to counterattack. The study of timing revealed that most people act either too quickly or too slowly because they're driven by anxiety rather than guided by clear perception. Anxiety makes you want to end uncertainty as rapidly as possible, leading to premature action that creates more problems than it solves. But anxiety also creates paralysis, making you hesitate and miss opportunities that require immediate response. Musashi learned to distinguish between these reactive patterns and the natural timing that emerges from calm awareness of what's actually happening. Perfect timing also requires what Musashi called strategic patience, the willingness to wait for the right moment, even when external pressure demands immediate action. In his famous duel with Sasaki Kojiro, he deliberately arrived hours late, knowing that his opponent's growing anger and impatience would disturb his mental clarity and create the opening Musashi needed. This wasn't cruelty, but strategic wisdom, understanding that sometimes the best action is allowing your opponent to defeat themselves through their own emotional reactivity. The development of timing sense also involves learning to recognize the difference between active waiting and passive hesitation. Passive hesitation is frozen inaction that comes from fear, doubt, or mental confusion. Active waiting is alert readiness that comes from clear perception of current conditions and patient confidence that the right moment will become obvious when it arrives. This distinction is crucial because they look similar from the outside but produce completely different results. Musashi also understood that timing operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the immediate timing of physical movements, the medium-term timing of tactical sequences, and the long-term timing of strategic positioning. Master warriors learn to coordinate all these levels so that their immediate actions serve both tactical and strategic objectives. This multi-dimensional thinking about timing applies to any complex undertaking where short-term decisions must serve long-term goals. The philosophy of perfect timing also includes recognition that some opportunities only arise once and must be seized immediately, while others recur regularly and can be approached more patiently. Distinguishing between these types requires deep understanding of the underlying forces and patterns that create opportunities in the first place. This knowledge comes partly from study and analysis, but more importantly, from intuitive sensitivity to the natural rhythms that govern all manifestation. Perhaps most subtly, Musashi discovered that perfect timing often involves acting just before circumstances force action upon you. There's a narrow window between the moment when you can see what needs to happen and the moment when external pressure removes your freedom to choose. Acting within this window allows you to maintain initiative and control while still responding appropriately to changing conditions. This proactive timing is one of the hallmarks of true mastery in any domain. The cultivation of timing sense also reveals the interconnected nature of all events. Nothing happens in isolation, and every action creates ripple effects that influence future possibilities. Master strategists learn to think several moves ahead, considering not just the immediate consequences of their actions, but the secondary and tertiary effects that will shape the conditions for future decisions. This system's thinking about timing allows much more sophisticated and effective planning than simple linear cause and effect reasoning. Part 9. The Way of Water: Adaptability and Flow. Musashi often spoke of learning from water, how it flows around obstacles without losing its essential nature, how it takes the shape of any container while maintaining its fundamental properties, how it can be soft enough to nourish life, yet powerful enough to carve through stone. This wasn't poetic metaphor, but practical wisdom about how to move through life with maximum effectiveness and minimum resistance, adapting to circumstances while never compromising your core principles. The Way of Water begins with understanding the difference between flexibility and weakness. Many people confuse adaptability with having no standards or convictions, but Musashi discovered the opposite. True flexibility requires being so clear about your essential nature and fundamental principles that you can adjust your methods and tactics without losing your identity. Water always flows downhill toward the ocean, but it will find 1,000 different paths to get there depending on the terrain it encounters. This principle applied directly to Musashi's approach to combat. Rather than developing a rigid fighting style that worked only under specific conditions, he cultivated the ability to adapt his technique to whatever his opponent presented. If they were aggressive, he became evasive. If they were defensive, he became penetrating. If they were fast, he relied on timing. If they were strong, he used their force against them. This adaptability made him nearly impossible to prepare for, because his response emerged from the actual situation rather than predetermined patterns. The Way of Water also taught Musashi about the power of yielding as a form of strength. When you push against water, it gives way completely, but the moment you stop pushing, it flows back to fill the space you occupied. This principle of tactical retreat and strategic advance became central to his understanding of conflict. Sometimes, the most powerful response to aggression is to step aside and allow your opponent's force to carry them past their intended target, leaving them off balance and vulnerable to counterattack. Flowing like water also requires what Musashi called no fixed mind, the ability to respond authentically to each moment without being trapped by previous decisions or future plans. Most people's responses to new situations are heavily influenced by their past experiences and future expectations, which prevents them from seeing what's actually happening right now. But water responds only to immediate conditions. The contours of the land, the force of gravity, the resistance it encounters. This present moment awareness allowed Musashi to respond to each opponent and each instant of combat with perfect appropriateness. The water principle extends beyond physical movement to mental and emotional adaptation. Musashi learned to let thoughts and feelings flow through his consciousness without getting caught by them or needing to act on them immediately. Anger, fear, excitement, and doubt would arise naturally in response to circumstances, but instead of being controlled by these emotions, he would observe them with the same detachment he brought to watching clouds pass through the sky. This emotional fluidity kept his judgment clear and his responses appropriate, regardless of what feelings were present. The way of water also illuminates the relationship between effort and accomplishment. Water accomplishes enormous work, carving canyons, powering mills, sustaining life, but it never appears to be trying hard. Its power comes from persistence, gravity, and perfect harmony with natural laws, rather than from force or struggle. Musashi applied this understanding to his own development, achieving mastery through consistent practice and natural development, rather than through strain or artificial pushing. Perhaps most importantly, the way of water teaches about the power of emptiness. Water has no fixed shape of its own, which is precisely what allows it to take any shape and flow through any opening. Similarly, Musashi cultivated a kind of strategic emptiness, having no fixed preferences about how situations should unfold, which paradoxically gave him unlimited options for how to respond. This emptiness wasn't vacancy, but rather fullness of potential, like a cup that can only be filled because it's empty. The water principle also reveals the futility of trying to control outcomes through force. You can temporarily dam water or channel it, but its fundamental nature is to flow toward equilibrium. Fighting against this natural tendency requires constant energy and eventually fails when the artificial constraints can no longer contain the accumulated pressure. Musashi learned to work with the natural forces present in any situation, rather than trying to impose his will through pure effort, achieving his objectives by helping what wanted to happen anyway. Part 10. The Unity of Life and Death. For Musashi, the deepest wisdom came from understanding that life and death were not opposites, but complementary aspects of a single reality. Through his countless encounters with mortal combat, he discovered that the fear of death was really fear of life itself. The anxiety about fully embracing existence because it inevitably includes loss, uncertainty, and the knowledge that everything you love will eventually end. Learning to die well meant learning to live completely, holding nothing back while attachment to nothing permanent. This unity became clear to Musashi during his early duels, when he noticed that his most effective fighting came not from trying to preserve his life, but from complete willingness to lose it if necessary. When you're desperately trying to avoid death, you become defensive, reactive, and predictable. But when you've genuinely accepted that death is inevitable anyway, you become free to act with total commitment and authenticity. This acceptance didn't make him careless or suicidal, but rather freed him from the psychological burden of trying to control the uncontrollable. The philosophy of life-death unity also transformed Musashi's understanding of victory and defeat. He realized that trying to win by avoiding loss was a losing strategy because it was based on fear rather than strength. True victory came from engaging so completely with whatever was happening that the outcome became irrelevant. When you fight with total presence and authentic skill, you've already succeeded regardless of whether you technically win or lose. This paradoxical approach to success made him nearly unbeatable because he wasn't fighting for victory, but from wholeness. Musashi also discovered that each moment contains both life and death simultaneously. Every breath involves the death of one moment and the birth of the next. Every decision kills infinite other possibilities, while giving birth to new circumstances. Every movement requires letting go of where you were to arrive where you're going. This constant dying and being reborn revealed that what most people call life is really just one half of a dynamic process that includes its opposite as an essential component. The acceptance of death also freed Musashi from the common human tendency to postpone authentic living until conditions are perfect. When you truly understand that death could come at any moment, you stop waiting for the right time to be honest, courageous, or loving. You say what needs to be said, do what needs to be done, and express what needs to be expressed because you recognize that this moment might be your last opportunity. This urgency paradoxically creates a deeper peace because you're no longer carrying the weight of unexpressed truth or uncommitted action. The unity of life and death also illuminated the artificial nature of most human fears. When you face the ultimate fear, the complete annihilation of everything you think you are, other anxieties reveal themselves as relatively manageable. The fear of embarrassment, financial loss, social rejection, or physical discomfort becomes much less compelling when measured against the reality of mortality. This doesn't make you insensitive to suffering, but rather helps you distinguish between genuine threats and imaginary dangers. Musashi's understanding of death also included recognition that what you really are cannot be killed. Through the process of repeatedly facing his own mortality, he discovered that consciousness itself is indestructible. Bodies die, personalities dissolve, memories fade, but the awareness in which all these experiences arise continues unchanged. This wasn't religious belief, but direct insight gained through extreme circumstances that stripped away everything temporary to reveal what was permanent. The life-death teaching also applies to the smaller deaths that occur throughout any meaningful existence. Every growth requires letting go of who you used to be. Every new understanding requires the death of previous beliefs. Every authentic relationship involves the death of the isolated self. Learning to die gracefully in these smaller ways prepares you for the final dissolution while making your current life richer and more authentic. Perhaps most practically, the unity of life and death teaches that the quality of your dying reflects the quality of your living. People who have lived with courage, honesty, and full engagement tend to face death with the same qualities. Those who have spent their lives in denial, cowardice, or half-hearted commitment often die as they lived, afraid, regretful, and incomplete. This connection between living and dying motivated Musashi to approach each day, each relationship, and each challenge as if it might be his last opportunity to express his deepest understanding and most authentic self. Part 11. The Mind Like a Mirror. One of Musashi's most profound insights concerned what he called mirror mind, a state of consciousness that reflects reality exactly as it is, without distortion, judgment, or interpretation. Like a perfect mirror that shows whatever appears before it, clearly while being changed by none of it, the mirror mind perceives circumstances, opponents, and situations with complete accuracy while maintaining perfect equanimity. This mental state became the foundation for all effective action and authentic response. The development of mirror mind begins with recognizing how much ordinary consciousness distorts perception through projection, assumption, and unconscious filtering. Most people don't see situations as they actually are, but rather as they expect them to be based on past experience current emotions, and future fears. They project their own mental content onto external circumstances and then react to their projections rather than to reality itself. This creates a kind of psychological hall of mirrors where you're fighting shadows of your own making rather than responding to what's actually present. Musashi discovered this distortion most clearly in combat situations where misreading an opponent's intentions could be fatal. He learned to distinguish between what he could actually observe, subtle changes in posture, breathing, and energy, and what his mind wanted to add through interpretation and anticipation. This required developing a kind of naked awareness that could perceive without immediately categorizing, judging, or strategizing about what was perceived. The mirror mind sees first and thinks second, allowing accurate perception to inform appropriate response. The cultivation of mirror consciousness also involves learning to reflect emotional states without being contaminated by them. When facing an angry opponent, the mirror mind clearly perceives the anger without becoming angry in return. When confronting fear in yourself or others, it acknowledges the fear without being paralyzed by it. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or disconnected, but rather developing the capacity to feel everything while being controlled by nothing. The mirror reflects all colors while having no color of its own. This state of consciousness also eliminates the psychological static that usually interferes with intuitive knowing. When your mind is cluttered with internal commentary, emotional reactions, and mental planning, it's difficult to access the deeper intelligence that emerges from complete presence. But when consciousness becomes mirror-like, clear, empty, and perfectly reflective, insights and appropriate responses arise naturally without effort or forcing. This intuitive wisdom is more reliable than analytical thinking in complex, rapidly changing situations. The mirror mind also reveals the interconnected nature of all experience. When you're no longer trapped in the separate sense of self that creates artificial boundaries between inside and outside, self and other, you begin to perceive the underlying unity that connects all phenomena. In combat, this might mean sensing your opponent's intentions as clearly as your own, or experiencing the entire fighting situation as a single dynamic system, rather than two separate individuals in conflict. Developing mirror consciousness requires what Musashi called polishing the mind, the daily practice of removing whatever clouds clear perception. This includes not just formal meditation or training, but the ongoing work of noticing and releasing habitual patterns of thought, emotional reactivity, and unconscious assumptions that distort awareness. Like polishing a physical mirror, this is never a finished process, but requires constant attention and care. The practical applications of mirror mind extend far beyond martial arts into every aspect of human interaction and decision-making. In relationships, it allows you to see people as they actually are, rather than as you want them to be, or fear they might be. In business or politics, it provides accurate assessment of situations without the distortion of wishful thinking or paranoid projection. In creative work, it allows authentic expression to emerge without interference from self-consciousness or artificial striving. Perhaps most importantly, the mirror mind reveals that what you really are is the very awareness that reflects all experience. You are not the contents of consciousness, the thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptions that come and go, but rather the mirror-like space in which all these experiences appear. Realizing this doesn't diminish your humanity, but rather reveals its deeper foundation in something timeless and indestructible that remains unchanged through all the transformations of life and death. Part 12. The Paradox of Strength Through Softness. One of the most counterintuitive aspects of Musashi's martial philosophy was his discovery that true strength often manifested through what appeared to be softness. The hardest, most aggressive fighters were often the easiest to defeat because their rigidity made them predictable, and their force could be redirected against them. Meanwhile, warriors who had learned to be supple, responsive, and internally relaxed while maintaining perfect alertness proved nearly impossible to overcome because they gave opponents nothing solid to push against. This principle became clear to Musashi through his study of different fighting styles and his observation of how various approaches worked under the pressure of real combat. He noticed that techniques based on meeting force with force often failed against truly skilled opponents who could redirect or absorb impact. But strategies that emphasize timing, positioning, and the ability to blend with an opponent's energy while redirecting it proved effective against a much wider range of adversaries. The paradox of strength through softness also applied to mental and emotional states. Musashi discovered that trying to suppress fear, anger, or doubt through willpower often intensified these emotions and made them more disruptive. But learning to remain soft and accepting toward whatever arose in consciousness, allowing thoughts and feelings to flow through awareness without resistance, actually provided more stability and freedom than trying to control internal experience through force. This softness wasn't weakness or passivity, but rather a kind of dynamic receptivity that could absorb and transform whatever it encountered. Like water that can gradually wear away the hardest stone, this quality of soft persistence proved more powerful than aggressive effort in achieving long-term objectives. It required a different kind of courage, the bravery to remain open and vulnerable even under extreme pressure, trusting that your essential nature was strong enough to handle whatever challenges arose. The cultivation of softness also revealed the difference between external gentleness and internal yielding. Musashi learned to maintain a soft, relaxed physical presence even while being completely prepared for instant, decisive action. This combination of apparent ease with actual readiness created a psychological advantage because opponents couldn't read his true intentions or level of preparedness. They often underestimated him because his energy seemed non-threatening, only to discover too late that his gentleness concealed devastating capability. The principle of strength through softness also governed Musashi's approach to learning and self-development. Rather than trying to force himself to acquire new skills or eliminate old habits through harsh discipline, he learned to work with his natural rhythms and inclinations, gradually shaping them in more effective directions. This patient, gentle approach to change proved more sustainable and ultimately more transformative than dramatic efforts at self-improvement that usually failed due to internal resistance. Perhaps most subtly, this teaching pointed toward the recognition that your deepest strength comes not from what you can control or dominate, but from your capacity to remain authentically yourself, regardless of external circumstances. This authentic selfhood is naturally soft because it has nothing to defend or prove, yet it's also unshakable because it's not dependent on anything external for its stability. This combination of vulnerability and invincibility is the hallmark of true mastery in any domain. The paradox also illuminates the relationship between effort and accomplishment in any skilled activity. Beginners typically try too hard, creating tension and interference that actually reduces their effectiveness. As skill develops, you learn to accomplish more with less effort, eventually reaching levels where maximum result comes from minimum forcing. This doesn't mean becoming lazy or unfocused, but rather learning to align your actions with natural principles so completely that great things happen with apparently little struggle. Musashi's understanding of softness also extended to his approach to conflict resolution beyond combat. He learned that many disputes could be resolved more effectively through yielding and redirection than through direct confrontation. By allowing opponents to express their aggression fully while staying centered and responsive, he often found that conflicts dissolved naturally as the other person exhausted their hostile energy against someone who provided no resistance to fuel further anger. Part 13. The Way of Continuous Learning. Throughout his life, Musashi maintained what he called student mind, the recognition that mastery is not a destination, but a way of traveling that involves constant learning, adaptation, and deeper understanding. Even after becoming the most feared swordsman in Japan, he continued to study, experiment, and refine his understanding as if he were still a beginner. This attitude of perpetual apprenticeship allowed him to continue growing and evolving long after most people would have considered their learning complete. The way of continuous learning begins with humility about how much you don't know, regardless of how much you've already mastered. Musashi observed that expertise in one area often creates false confidence about your understanding of related areas, leading to premature certainty and closed-mindedness. True masters maintain what Zen calls don't-know mind, the recognition that every situation contains elements you haven't encountered before and possibilities you haven't yet imagined. This learning mindset also requires comfort with being wrong, making mistakes, and having your current understanding challenged by new experience. Most people become defensive when their knowledge is questioned or their methods prove inadequate. But Musashi learned to treat these moments as valuable opportunities for growth. Every mistake contained information about reality that his previous understanding had missed, making errors essential feedback rather than embarrassing failures. The continuous learning path also involves seeking out the most challenging teachers and situations rather than staying in comfortable environments where your existing skills are adequate. Musashi deliberately sought fights with opponents who used different styles, strategies, and weapons because each encounter taught him something new about combat and about himself. This willingness to repeatedly place himself in situations where he might fail or look incompetent was crucial to his development beyond conventional limits. Musashi also understood that learning requires integrating insights from multiple domains rather than becoming narrowly specialized. His studies of painting, poetry, sculpture, and philosophy weren't diversions from his martial training, but essential components of it. Each discipline revealed different aspects of the same underlying principles that governed all effective action. This cross-training of consciousness allowed him to make connections and discoveries that wouldn't have been possible through single-minded focus on swordsmanship alone. The way of continuous learning also includes teaching as an essential component of mastery. Musashi discovered that explaining principles to students forced him to articulate and clarify understanding that had previously been intuitive and unconscious. The questions and difficulties of beginners often revealed gaps, or assumptions in his own knowledge that needed further investigation. Teaching became another form of learning that deepened his mastery while helping others develop their own capabilities. This learning approach also emphasizes direct experience over theoretical knowledge. While Musashi was well-read and intellectually sophisticated, he never trusted any idea until he had tested it personally under real conditions. This empirical attitude kept his understanding practical and reliable because it was based on what actually worked rather than what seemed logical or traditional. He was willing to discard beloved theories when experience contradicted them, and to embrace insights that came from unexpected sources. The continuous learning path also requires what Musashi called beginner's eyes, the ability to see familiar situations with fresh perception rather than through the filter of past experience. This means approaching each opponent, each day of training, and each life challenge as if encountering it for the first time, remaining open to possibilities and nuances that routine thinking might miss. This freshness of perception keeps learning alive even in areas where you have considerable expertise. Perhaps most importantly, the way of continuous learning recognizes that the deepest teachings often come from life itself rather than from formal instruction. Musashi learned as much from observing water, wind, and growing things as he did from studying martial arts techniques. This willingness to find instruction everywhere, in failure and success, in nature and human society, in art and practical activity, transforms every experience into potential wisdom, and every moment into an opportunity for deeper understanding. Part 14. The integration of warrior and sage. In his later years, Musashi achieved a rare synthesis of the warrior's direct engagement with reality and the sage's transcendent understanding of existence. This integration didn't require abandoning either the martial way or the contemplative path, but rather discovering how they could support and deepen each other. The result was a way of being that combined fierce effectiveness with profound peace, complete engagement with ultimate detachment. The warrior aspect of Musashi's nature provided the foundation of practical competence and tested wisdom that kept his philosophical insights grounded in reality. His understanding of courage, discipline, timing, and strategic thinking came from decades of putting these qualities to the ultimate test in life or death situations. This experiential foundation prevented his later contemplative insights from becoming abstract or divorced from the practical challenges of human existence. The sage dimension emerged gradually as Musashi's mastery of external challenges led him to investigate the internal sources of conflict and confusion. He began to see that the same mental patterns that created problems in combat, attachment, fear, rigid thinking, emotional reactivity, were also the root causes of suffering in ordinary life. This recognition led him toward practices and insights that address these psychological patterns at their source rather than just managing their symptoms. The integration of these two paths required understanding that external mastery and internal freedom were not separate achievements, but different aspects of the same developmental process. Learning to fight effectively required developing many of the same qualities that spiritual traditions cultivate: presence, clarity, equanimity, and the ability to act without being controlled by results. Conversely, genuine spiritual development required the warrior qualities of courage, persistence, and willingness to face uncomfortable truths about yourself and reality. Musashi's warrior sage synthesis also included the recognition that true strength serves wisdom rather than ego. The ability to defeat any opponent or overcome any obstacle becomes meaningless if it's not guided by deep understanding of what's worth fighting for and what's worth protecting. Physical and strategic power without wisdom often creates more problems than it solves, while wisdom without the ability to act effectively remains merely philosophical speculation. This integration also transformed Musashi's relationship to conflict itself. Earlier in his life, he had sought out fights to prove his skill and establish his reputation. But as his understanding deepened, he began to see conflict as one of many possible responses to circumstances, not necessarily the best or most appropriate one. The highest level of martial arts, he realized, was often being so clearly capable yet non-threatening that potential opponents chose not to fight rather than risk the consequences. The warrior sage path also required balancing engagement with detachment, caring deeply about the quality of your actions while remaining unattached to their outcomes. This paradoxical attitude allowed maximum effectiveness because it eliminated the anxiety and second-guessing that interfere with natural ability, while also providing the inner peace that comes from accepting whatever results emerge from your best efforts. Perhaps most importantly, the integration of warrior and sage qualities created what Musashi called compassionate strength, the ability to respond to aggression and ignorance with firm kindness rather than reactive hostility. This doesn't mean being passive in the face of genuine threats, but rather responding to challenging people and situations from wisdom and care rather than from ego and fear. This quality of enlightened strength protects what's valuable while helping rather than harming those who create problems through their own confusion and suffering. The mature Musashi embodied the principle that the highest martial arts are indistinguishable from the highest spiritual arts, both pointing toward a way of being that is completely responsive to life while being disturbed by nothing, fully engaged with existence while attached to nothing, capable of any action while preferring peace. This integration represents perhaps the most complete form of human development, combining the best qualities of both contemplative and active approaches to awakening. Part 15. Legacy of the Void. In his final work, The Book of the Void, Musashi attempted to convey the most essential teaching that emerged from his lifetime of study and practice, an understanding so fundamental that it underlies all techniques, strategies, and philosophies, yet can't be captured in any of them. The void he wrote about wasn't emptiness in the sense of absence or negation, but rather the pregnant fullness from which all possibilities emerge and to which they return. This teaching of the void represents Musashi's recognition that the source of all effective action lies beyond the realm of technique and knowledge in a dimension of pure awareness that's simultaneously empty of content and full of potential. From this void state, appropriate responses emerge spontaneously, without the delay of conscious deliberation. It's the space between thoughts where insight arises, the pause between heartbeats where perfect timing lives, the stillness at the center of movement where true power originates. The practical application of void consciousness means learning to act from emptiness rather than from the accumulated patterns of past experience and future expectation. When your mind is full of preconceptions about how situations should unfold, you can't perceive what's actually happening or respond authentically to emerging circumstances. But when consciousness becomes like empty space, clear, open, and infinitely receptive. It can contain and reflect any experience without being limited or distorted by it. Understanding the void also reveals why Musashi's teachings often emphasized what not to do rather than prescribing specific techniques. The void can't be grasped or possessed because it's not a thing, but rather the absence of all things, the clearing away of everything unnecessary to reveal what was always already present. This apophatic approach to mastery involves progressive elimination of interference rather than accumulation of abilities. The void teaching also illuminates the relationship between form and formlessness in all skilled activity. Technical training provides the foundation of competence and the vocabulary of possible responses, but mastery emerges when this technical knowledge becomes so thoroughly integrated that it operates spontaneously from the void of no knowledge. The form serves its purpose by eventually dissolving into formlessness, like a ladder that can be discarded once you've reached where it was pointing. This understanding also reveals why Musashi could be simultaneously the most deadly warrior of his era and a man of profound peace. The void that he learned to embody was not aggressive or peaceful, winning or losing, living or dying. It was the source from which all these apparent opposites emerged and the space in which they were revealed to be complementary aspects of a single reality. Acting from this understanding naturally produces appropriate responses without the inner conflict that comes from trying to be something you're not. The legacy of the void also includes the recognition that what you really are cannot be captured in any description, achieved through any practice, or lost through any failure. Your true nature is the very void awareness in which all experiences arise and pass away. Realizing this doesn't require years of training or special abilities. It's available in any moment when you stop identifying with the content of consciousness long enough to recognize the awareness that makes all content possible. Perhaps most practically, the void teaching offers liberation from the burden of having to be someone special or accomplish something extraordinary to justify your existence. The void is equally present in beginners and masters, failures and successes, ordinary moments and peak experiences. Recognizing this allows you to engage fully with life's challenges and opportunities while knowing that your essential worth doesn't depend on any particular outcome or achievement. Musashi's final gift was pointing toward this dimension of existence that can't be taught, but only recognized, can't be achieved, but only uncovered, can't be gained, but only remembered. The void is both the destination of all spiritual and martial training and the source from which that training emerges. Understanding this doesn't end the journey of development, but reveals that the journey and the destination were never separate. That what you're seeking has been present all along as the very awareness that's doing the seeking. In the end, Musashi's greatest victory was not over any external opponent, but over the illusion of separation that makes opponents seem necessary. His deepest teaching wasn't any particular technique, but the recognition of the void nature that's equally present in student and master, victory and defeat, life and death. This understanding transforms every moment into an opportunity for awakening, and every challenge into a chance to express the indestructible peace that lies at the heart of all authentic action. The way of the sword ultimately reveals itself as the way of the void, not through accumulating power or knowledge, but through the progressive recognition of what you've always been underneath all the stories about who you think you are. This is Musashi's final teaching and his most precious gift. The invitation to discover for yourself the unborn, undying awareness that needs no technique to express itself perfectly and no victory to confirm its worth.